when I was at GSA, my first rule was no jerks. If you're miserable to work with, I don't care how good you are.
Leadership, Joe. Remember that.
Quiet.
Just curious. So thanks, Emily. Appreciate it.
We had one agency that was stockpiling hand sanitizer. I had to explain to them that if you have thousands of gallons of hand sanitizer, it is equivalent of having a bomb in the building because it is so highly flammable.
Welcome to the Opportunity Accelerators, the show where professionals at any stage of their career can learn how to level up from those that have found success and have the scars to prove it. Our goal for this show is to sort of be a mentorship and a podcast, but we also touch on other topics in the tech industry, in particular, how we can create more and better pathways to great jobs. I'm Vince Verga, here with my friends and business partners, the Australian aristocrat, Justin Vianello, and the Lord of Liverpool, Joe Mitchell. Welcome, guys.
The Lord of the Rings.
Good to be here.
And with us today, we have the Queen of Government Contracting, Emily Murphy. Emily is a leading expert in government contracting and the business of government. Throughout her career, Emily has held multiple leadership roles in the federal government, including serving as administrator of the U.S. General Services Administration, where she oversaw 11,000 employees and over $75 billion in annual contracts. Previously, Emily was GSA's Chief Acquisition Officer and also served at the Small Business Administration. Prior to that, Emily spent 9 years in various procurement policy roles for the House of Representatives. Emily has also had several leadership roles in the private sector. She is currently a senior fellow at George Mason University and runs her own consulting firm. She serves on a number of boards, including being an advisory board member for SkillStorm, where I can tell you firsthand her experience in leadership is helping us accelerate opportunities for thousands of stormers and our clients. So Emily, welcome.
Welcome, Emily.
Great to be here. So good to be here.
All right. Well, we're going to, Joe, I think, wanted to kick things off with you, Emily. So Joe, take it away.
Yeah. Hey, Emily, welcome to the pod. It's great to have you on. The one thing Vince mentioned at the outset is you're the Queen of Government Contracting, and it became very clear early on that you've got a real interest in the royal family. So I'm just wondering where all of that came from.
Were my interest in government contracting or my interest in the royal family?
Well, we'll start with the royal family.
Joe's, as you know,
Joe has a keen interest in
this.
He's
a huge fan of the royals, so that's why I wanted to start there.
I was a history major. I was a history major in college, history and French for my two degrees, neither of which has actually proved terribly useful in my adult life other than teaching me how to write and do other things. But part of that is the history of Europe is the history of royal families and how they get along, marry, don't get along, divorce. It's the conflicts. I mean, I think World War I is pretty much cousins not getting along. So that I think that's where the interest in it came from. Just having traced generations and generations of these families. To now, it's a little bit like just watching a soap opera.
Yeah, it certainly is. So today, who's your favorite royal today?
Oh, probably Princess Anne, the Princess Royal.
Oh, that's interesting. I wasn't expecting that. That's a curveball. Why Princess Anne?
She gets the job done. She's quiet about it. She's not seeking the spotlight. She's very, I think she's very much an old school, what I consider a very good model of quiet leadership.
Interesting.
Quiet leadership, Joe. Remember that.
Quiet. Those are two words that we shouldn't put in the same sentence with Joe.
Well, just curious. So thanks, Emily. Appreciate it.
So, Emily, I've got a question. For someone who was doing history and French as a major in university, who then now has experience in government contracting, government roles, can we explore that journey from what you initially intended to do at university to where you ended up?
So when I went to college, I went to Smith College in Western Massachusetts. And as I said, I studied history, loved looking at history and revolutions, history of Europe. I loved all of it. Ended up spending my junior year at the University of Geneva and taking enough French and doing that, taking all my classes in French that counted, that I didn't have to do a whole lot more to get the second major, and thought that I was going to go into international affairs of some sort. I thought I was going to go work for the UN or something along those lines, State Department, something like that. Graduated from college, and it was 1995. The economy wasn't great. Knew I wanted to take a year off, but it had been accepted to law school, was going to go to WashU for law school, Washington University in St. Louis, but wanted to take a year off first. So got an internship with my hometown congressman, a guy named Jim Talent. So I moved to DC, thought it would be for 1 year. Now, this was 1995. It is now 2023. I still live in DC. That tells you how well I did with that commitment. But I started working for him, and he became the chairman of the House Small Business Committee. He hired me at that point in time, and I was the junior staffer. Junior staffer gets assigned the issues that no one else wants to work on. So it's, basically everyone has to throw away their least favorite issue, and the new kid gets those issues. I got government contracting, telecommunications, and disaster lending. And that was my portfolio for several years. I sort of fell in love with government contracting. I've worked in telecom. I've had a lot of experience in disaster management since then. But government contracting has been the consistent one in that I saw in it, and at the time, I think we were doing about $300 billion, $250, $300 billion a year in government contracts. We're now over $600
That was for the
billion.
whole, sorry to interrupt, but that was for the whole federal government at the time?
That was the whole federal government at the time.
Wow.
And
what is it today?
It's over $600 billion these days. So it's more than doubled since I started in the space. But saw the opportunity in it that if you could do things better, it made it better for small businesses. It made it better from a government spending perspective because you could save money. You could actually get what you wanted to, get accomplished faster, cheaper, better, easier. There were all sorts of ways you could make a difference in it. And so I, after a few years, decided that I did need to go back to law school. I'd been living in Virginia long enough at that point in time that I qualified as an in-state resident. And so I ended up going to UVA. Came out, practiced government contracts law for a few years. And it was by that point in time, we were in the middle of the Bush administration. They needed someone to come in and help with the government contracting programs at SBA. And I was that weird combination of someone who had the right political credentials at that point and knew government contracting, which is, there's a very, very small Venn diagram of overlap between those two. So at 30 years old, I went in and was running all the government contracting and business development programs. While I was there, Congress passed a law creating a chief acquisition officer at all federal agencies. And GSA was going through a bunch of problems. They had a series of audits that had ended horribly, and they needed to fix things or they were going to be forced to shut down their acquisition systems. So they wanted someone who could come in and deal with a problem, and so they put me in that job, and I ran GSA's acquisition for a few years, and then went back out and went in-house with a company and ran operations for a telecom company in the government contracting space. So they were a satellite company, satellite telecommunications. Did that and then in 2011 went back to the Hill and spent time with the Small Business Committee again, and then with the House Armed Services Committee. And interestingly, just to prove like you never know what's going to end up spurring things in your life. My first subcommittee chairman at the Small Business Committee was a guy named Mick Mulvaney. And Mick went on to be the OMB director and ultimately the acting chief of staff to President Trump. But I worked with him for a couple of years in his subcommittee role. He left the committee, went on to other things. I ran into him again in 2016 during the presidential transition. He was going to be OMB director. He asked if I wanted to do something. I said, sure, I'd love to run the Office of Federal Procurement Policy within the Office of Management and Budget. So I'm guessing the job none of you have ever heard of. It's the nerdiest government contracting job there is. In that you essentially do government contracts policy for the executive branch, for the entire executive branch. And so he agreed to promote me for that job. They asked if I, while I was waiting to be nominated, because they wanted him to be nominated first and be confirmed and get people in and if I'd be willing to go back to GSA and help set GSA up. I said, sure, that sounds great. So I went to GSA and I helped them hire people. And it was a really good job that I liked the people that I hired when I was at GSA, because a few months later they asked me if I would want to stay at GSA. I said, well, I don't really want to do personnel at GSA. And they said, no, do you want to run GSA? I said, oh, okay, well, what would you like me to do? I said, well, what would you want to do running GSA? Like, what would your priorities be? So, and we went from there, and I gave them my 3 priorities. So they nominated me for GSA in September of 17. I was confirmed that year and served as the GSA administrator for 4 years.
Yeah, so that's interesting, right? So I think kind of what you're describing is, you had an idea of where your career was going to go into school. While you were in school, you get out of school and then you fall in love with something completely different. A lot of times you'll hear people give advice that, if you want to be successful, attach yourself to a big problem and really work to solve it. So when you're at the GSA, you've got 11,000 employees and billions of dollars in contracts. Talk to us about some of the biggest problems that you dealt with and what kind of success you had in addressing those.
So I'll take a step back. What you're talking about, have you ever read Angela Duckworth?
Grit.
Her book, Grit?
Yeah.
I think that describes my career to a T, in that if you can find yourself in something that seems to the rest of the world is fairly esoteric, dry, obscure, but the more you do it and the better you get at it, the more fascinating you'll find it, to the point where I really love government contracting. Which very few people in the world will identify with that statement. But by giving your all to something and becoming good at it, you really do have the chance to find it to be incredibly meaningful and fulfilling. At GSA, we had the problem that at the time that I took over as administrator, we had 381 million square feet of office space we were managing. We owned about half of that. We leased the other half of it. For those leases, our average lease at the time was 6 years. Our average tenancy was 23 years. So we were paying to renew our lease every 5, 6, 7 years for space we were never going to move out of. So went through and worked with them on getting better long-term leases. We had a lot of GSA contracts. They call them GSA schedules. And if you were a customer of GSA and you wanted to buy a solution, we had all the pieces to the puzzle. You had to figure, but it came basically as a boxed jigsaw puzzle where you still had to put it all together yourself. So we took away all the different schedules and combined them into one contract with different areas in them, so that you could basically make a bespoke solution using those contract vehicles. I shouldn't say that bespoke, because it was all commercial type items, but we really did a lot to make it a lot easier for agencies to buy using GSA, and a lot easier for for businesses to sell using GSA. Not going to claim it's easy, because it's the government, and nothing can ever be simple, but easier. So we worked on that. We created a commercial platform. So we looked at a lot of the low dollar things that the government was buying. We saw that across agencies, they were starting to use Amazon, frankly, a lot more. So Congress worked with us and came up with authority for GSA to run a commercial platform. And so we ended up contracting with Amazon and with Fisher Scientific and Overstock.com and arranging for the government to use their tools and their platforms to actually make sales available. And it saved us a lot of money in doing that, but it also meant that customer agencies could buy the way they wanted to, and small businesses that were selling $5,000, $10,000 or less at a time didn't have to go through all the bureaucracy of getting a regular government contract. So it saved them a lot of money also.
Emily, for those that might not be familiar with the General Services Administration, GSA, can you just kind of explain at a high level what their function is?
So GSA is where every good idea the government has that doesn't have a natural home goes. And that's a vast generalization, but it's primarily focused on public buildings, so managing the government's real estate. Doesn't manage military bases, but it manages most of the other domestic real estate, so the courthouses, federal buildings, you know, headquarters buildings for agencies. The West Wing is a GSA facility. So, all of that. It also then helps with acquisition. So it helps agencies, if for things that are bought routinely by agencies, whether it's office supplies, IT, even at this point in time, AI is included, professional services, everything along those lines. GSA will put in place contracts that make it easier for agencies to go in and place orders rather than having to do a whole new contract, each time that they want to make a purchase. So, and that's where about $75 billion of procurement was going my last year. It runs the government's fleet of all the vehicles that the government runs, the government's credit cards, the government's travel programs, and then it also does things like policy. So, how does the government buy? How does the government travel? What are the government's management regulations? How does the government invest in shared services? Things. So, it's an interesting combination of things. So, and unlike most federal agencies where the ultimate customer is a citizen using the services, at GSA, the customer is almost always another federal agency. So it facilitates other agencies getting their job done.
Got it. And, it's interesting. You brought up the real estate issue with the leases and all that. Fast forward to the beginning of 2020. And all of a sudden, everybody's got to work from home. You've not only got 11,000 employees at GSA that you've got to figure out remote work for, but you're also involved in the other 2 million federal workers that had to figure out remote work. So talk to us about that. What was that challenge like for you?
So I still remember sending everyone home on March 16th of 2020, and we did it. We sent each region home separately because there was this thought that you were going to be able to bring regions back faster because this was only going to be for a few weeks. Honestly, I remember thinking that when we sent people home, it would be for 2 weeks, 3 weeks tops.
That's what we all thought.
I remember, yeah. And I remember thinking I was really lucky because GSA had a great IT infrastructure. And so that we could telework, we'd actually practice teleworking on our own, previously to make sure that we could go and do this and that we were good to go. And actually, GSA's IT worked really, really well. We had great people working on it. We had great leadership in that space. But we then had all these customer agencies that didn't have those systems in place. And in some cases, their employees didn't even have laptops or cell phones. So all of a sudden, in the middle of these supply chain problems, we're dealing with, first, how do you take care of the people who actually have to be in an office? Because there's some jobs you couldn't do from home. I'm thinking, situation room. How do you make sure those spaces are cleaned and taken care of?
Like a lot of the classified work they would have to do from a secure facility, right?
Or VA hospitals.
Right.
There was, how do you make sure you've got enough cleaning supplies? And that was a challenge. Then we had other, agencies who wanted to send people home, but they needed laptops. And there were not enough domestically available laptops. The government has a rule that you have to buy a trade agreement act compliant laptops. You can't buy them that are directly manufactured in China. Usually we buy from either Dell or from HP, and they have, we only buy the subset of their laptops that are then transformed in a compliant country, and if they finish their manufacturing there. There weren't enough available. So working on waivers to allow for short-term, allow for spot buys of non-compliant laptops because we needed to keep the government running. And the agencies were willing to take on the risk knowing that they couldn't keep those laptops in the long run, but at least it would get them, keep them functioning until they could. Or just, new challenges on things to buy and how to implement them and how to make sure that everyone was okay, because the great thing about being able to work remotely is that everyone got to stay home. The bad thing about working remotely was that with people staying home, you didn't know if someone was sick necessarily. You didn't know as quickly. So how did you make sure your employees were safe? How did you make sure everything was? So it was a wild ride.
So one of the things, obviously, you've talked a lot about the challenges there, Emily. When you look back now, having to make all of that transition for 11,000 plus employees, plus another 2 million federal or civilian contractors, Are there some things that come out of that that are enormously positive that you look back and say, we could take this or this? Here's what we learned.
So I'd say that like one of the things we learned, making those decisions, early without you have to make decisions with the information you've got. You can't wait till you've got perfect information. And so some of the things looking back on it probably didn't make sense. Some of those initial policies around COVID didn't make the greatest sense.
Well, is that like leaving the box outside your house for 2 days like we used to do before you bring it into your house?
Those things, you didn't need to do that. One of the things I'll say that was great about the administration was they gave us the freedom to do what we needed to do to manage the people we had. And so if you decided this was the right thing for the health and safety of your workforce, you did it. You sent them home. It also showed me just how much flexibility you can have and how people rise to that challenge. So people didn't abuse that freedom or that flexibility. If anything, people were concerned that, they were home with their kids and they weren't, they couldn't work their regular hours or they were having challenges getting that. And the fact that they were raising to us the problem of, am I working enough? And we were able to, in every situation, work with them to find a way to make it work. That was just such a breath of fresh air. We actually figured out that GSA was more productive in 2020 than it had been in 2019 in terms of per employee productivity, just because people really gave their all and came together to support the mission of the agency. And frankly, which at that point in time was supporting agencies like HHS and VA and others who were trying to provide for health and safety across the country.
Yeah, well, on that note, I think you've kind of touched on this. Your agency, under your leadership, had the highest customer, vendor, and employee satisfaction in the history of the agency. So what do you credit that to?
We talked a lot, which it sounds silly, but the employee satisfaction was listening to and talking to employees a lot. And then, even if you were going to make a decision that you knew wasn't going to be popular, explaining it and giving people a chance to question it. But usually you could figure, if you talked to the employees enough and you shared with them why you were doing something, there was a way to make it work. With customers, I'd say it was the same thing. We really focused on what they needed and better ways to deliver what they needed. And with vendors, we spent a lot of time talking about how do we make it easier for them to sell into the government and reduce the burden of doing so. Because, I think you all have experienced it. Going into the government, contracting space, there are a lot of regulations and rules and processes and that just aren't intuitive and that don't make sense if you're not firmly embedded in that space. So sorry, Justin, you were going to say something?
Yeah, no, I've actually got a follow-on question on that. Is obviously you got a good outcome. Was that your goal, Emily, taking on that role? Did you spoke about the sort of 3 key points that you were going to focus on. When you took on the role in the GSA, did you say, look, our target of the next X many years is to get our satisfaction rating up? Was that one of your goals, or just by doing what you wanted to do in terms of your target, that was the outcome that you achieved?
So actually the goal was first and foremost to save taxpayers money. That was the number one goal across the public building service, the Federal Acquisition Service, across the policy sides, with shared services, all of it. And we're actually able to save, it was, and I still have the novelty check, but it was $21.6 billion over 3 years that we were able to deliver in savings. And I think that anytime you save your customers money like that, that improves their satisfaction score, but it also gives employees a sense of what it is they're actually doing. So they got to see the systems get better. They got to see what they were delivering get better, but they also got to be responsible for returning that, as I said, $21.6 billion. That's something to be really proud of. And by doing that, we also then attracted more vendors, and and we kept our vendors happy because they saw real opportunity. They didn't always like it when we negotiated their prices down, but it was creating real meaningful opportunities rather than you can get a seat on a contract, but you're never going to get any work from it. By focusing on dollars and then coming up with policies that got us there, that were good for, and those policies had to be good for employees, they had to be good for customer agencies, they had to be good for vendors. I think that that's what ultimately delivered the results.
You spend a lot of time in the SBA, so obviously had a lot of exposure to small businesses, some of the challenges they have, the issues they have. What is your view on the importance of small businesses? And what's your view on how the government can support them and should better support them in terms of fueling jobs and fueling growth for the economy?
So I spent a little over a year with the Small Business Administration itself, but I then spent over, 7 years working for the committee that oversaw the Small Business Administration, which it's an interesting perspective to be on both sides of it. I spent some time with Congress before I went to SBA and some time with Congress again after I'd been at SBA. And when you look across the country, small businesses, without a doubt, they create the majority of private sector jobs, the vast majority of private sector jobs. They are the engines of economic growth. You can't overstate the importance of small business. They're also, frankly, one of our top centers of innovation. Small businesses bring in so much of that innovative and entrepreneurial growth across the country, and our new technologies that are emerging. They do all of those things. The SBA does a great job in terms of government guaranteed loans, but they only go to a certain amount. And that's hopefully by the time you make it above that guarantee, the company is secure enough that it can get independent financing. They do a great job with the small business development centers are one of the best kept secrets, I think, in the United States. Those and what used to be called the Procurement Technical Assistance Centers, they're now called the Apex Centers. But they're free if you're interested in government contracting. They're a great resource that will help with basically the fundamentals of government contracting, getting you into the systems that you need to do, understand the compliance risk. They're wonderful. There are all these goals, though, that we have around government contracting. Right now, it says, we've got a goal that 23% of prime contract dollars go to small business, 5% go to small disadvantaged businesses, 5% to women, 5% to service disabled, or 3% to service disabled veteran, 3% to hub zone companies. All of those sound great, but even with those goals and the fact that the goals have gone up, that the administration has gone in and said we actually want small disadvantaged businesses to be at 15% by 2025. We're seeing a lot of businesses stop doing business with the government. In fact, it's since 2020, the number of businesses in the defense space from 2010 to 2020, the number of small businesses dropped by over 41%, even though the dollars to those businesses went up by 15%. So we spend more money with a lot fewer companies. And the civilian space, they've dropped by more than 50%, even though dollars are going up. So we have a shrinking industrial base problem. And that's where I'd love to see the government spend more focus on supporting businesses, because at the end of the day, if we don't have companies that can help us during a COVID crisis, who provide the technical skills we need, that are doing the manufacturing, that are doing the R&D, then we're at a incredible disadvantage compared to the Chinese and to others in the global stage, and it puts us at a national security risk. So I'd love to see us focusing on high-tech industries in the government and trying to really focus on getting more small businesses engaged there.
Why do you think there's that trend, Emily? Is it just the cost and the infrastructure required to do business with government is substantial? Why do you think you're seeing those trends where there's more dollars but less activity actually happening in that particular space?
So I think, and to be fair, it's not just happening in the small business space. It's also happening in the large business space. We have fewer businesses doing business with the government, even though as I talked about, the dollars have more than doubled in my career, the government spending. But we have fewer businesses now than we did back in 1995 doing business with the government. I think that the reasons are it's incredibly difficult from a regulatory perspective to do business with the government. so we make it tough to do business with them. For small businesses, once you hit a certain size, you were suddenly, there's no mid-sized business as far as the government's concerned. You're either small or other than small. And so you sort of walk off a cliff. And we haven't made it very easy for those businesses to figure out a strategy to go across. So at that point in time, most of them will either be acquired by a large business and then they go away, or they fail. Or they either are acquired, you fail, or you make a decision to remain small and artificially limit your own growth so that you don't leave that small business space.
See, that's interesting. Sorry, Emily, I didn't mean to interrupt. What you said, there's less businesses now in the federal government. There's also a trend of less younger people working for the federal government. So I did see some statistics that said less than 6% of federal IT workers are under the age of 30. So what challenges do you see with that? Especially, you talked about national security risks earlier. When it comes to cybersecurity, what could we be doing better and more of to encourage more people into technology roles in the federal government?
So it's a great question, Joe, and I'll give you one other data point on it. I was talking to my old agency recently, and they told me that they now have more contracting officers over the age of 70 than they do under the age of 25.
Wow. It's crazy.
And I think in the federal space, if we don't attract and keep younger employees, we're not going to have that mid-career or senior level of expertise. I think one of the challenges has been that it's hard to get hired by the federal government, in that the government still looks, and there have been some waiver programs, but they've never been terribly successful. The government still looks first and foremost at what degree do you have? And they use the degree as being the equivalent of your knowledge, which isn't, I don't think it's a fair thing, because frankly, my having a degree in history would count the same as someone else having a degree in cybersecurity. And right. It's not the same level of skill. You don't want me doing your cybersecurity. I can do the policy on it, but I don't think you want me doing the actual implementation. So I think the government needs to be more focused on skill and actually hiring people based on their skills, and that's a challenge. They've also got to do a better job of maintaining the skill set of the employees they have, because they've got good people and they're smart people, but that once you're in the government, it's hard to get follow-on training and enough training. And the budgets are always limited, and I know that when I was at GSA, we prioritized putting money into training employees, but it's a challenge across the government because the budgets are contracting, and how do you make that training available? And how do you make it available on a broad basis, on demand, as people need it, so that you've got them having continuing education? I find it fascinating in acquisition. We've always had things like the Federal Acquisition Institute, the Defense Acquisition University. The government's actually invested in having its own trainers, and then bringing in contractors to supplement that. You haven't done that on the IT side. Every agency does its own thing. So that there isn't that that standardization or that required the same level of requirements. There are requirements for training, but it's not done the same way. Yeah. And then we don't do a good job of incentivizing people to stay, because you can be the best practitioner in the world in the government, but to get promoted, you usually have to then become a manager. And being a manager isn't necessarily what you're good at. So we haven't figured out enough ways to take people who are really talented in IT, cybersecurity, AI, things like that, and give them a career path that makes sense that gets them to a senior level in the government. We'll get them to a good journeyman level, and then we don't really know what to do to give them that next level of career opportunities. So at that point in time, a lot of those individuals leave and go to the private sector where they can make a lot more money.
Absolutely. And I think you've hit on two pertinent points there. One is, how do you advance people's careers through upskilling, and there's never been anything more important than trying to keep people current with the latest technologies, as the pace of change is fairly rapid and it's only accelerating. And then if you're not doing that, how are you going to stay current? So therefore you need to bring outside vendors. And then 3, those people are going to leave for other opportunities where they can get those upskilling opportunities so they can advance their career. What would you do if you could wave a magic wand? What would you do to change the way in which the federal government look at cybersecurity and IT in general?
Skills-based hiring. Absolutely skills-based hiring. If anything, I'd actually even make it easier to hire veterans who come out of programs like VetTech. I think that the government, this is my policy perspective, not the companies or anyone else's, but I think that there should be direct hire for veterans who've completed a VetTech preferred provider program.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
And that gives the government the ability to get some of its dollars back as well. Its own dollars.
Yeah, if the government, it would prove the investment. It would make it easier to hire veterans who are already incredibly mission driven and who make great federal employees, who have cutting edge skills. They're right on the forefront of it, and then have the ability to keep going back and getting additional training. So I mean, like, to me, it makes perfect sense. But until I go back to work for Congress again, I don't know that I'm going to be able to make that happen.
You talked about, obviously skills-based hiring, and I think we found that, not that it's easy, but, we can assess people for potential, and we've been pretty successful in getting the technical knowledge in their head. The biggest factor that we found is soft skills are really the most important thing. And we were talking a little bit earlier, you'd mentioned, obviously, you've interviewed a bunch of people. You mentioned grit earlier as being a, pretty important characteristic. Talk to us about what you look for when you're hiring somebody on the soft skill side that lets you think that they have the ability to be successful.
When I was at GSA, my first rule was no jerks. If you're miserable to work with, I don't care how good you are. Life's too short for us all to be working with jerks. So no jerks. I will say one of the questions I would ask every person I interviewed was, tell me about yourself, which is a softball question. Now, the answer I was looking for was a brief summary of someone's career as to how it would apply to the job they were looking at. The answers I got, and the people I hired answered the question, perfectly, appropriately and perfectly. I got answers that were all across the board. I had one person who answered that she'd be great at GSA because her last company had gone bankrupt due to bad contracts, so she could recognize bad contracts. I had people talk to me about their family drama, about their sex lives, about their children's health issues. I mean, just things that gave you a real sense for them as a person, but also made you question whether they knew why you were in the room together, why you were having this interview, because it wasn't a counseling session. Or the advice I give people is be able to explain why your background is good for the job that you're applying for, and then also know something about the organization, because that was the other one. When I'd ask people why they'd want to work at GSA, the number of people who said that they didn't really know what GSA did, but they'd been sent there to interview was disappointing. And again, those weren't people we hired either, because if you find something that you know about that organization, why you want to work there, because you're going to be spending a lot of time there. And if you don't like their mission, if you don't believe in what the company's doing or the agency's doing, I don't think you as an individual are going to be happy in that job.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, right? I think, every company has a culture, whether they go out of their way to define that or not. And I think understanding what that culture is, and whether that's a fit for you and your values as a person, right? And otherwise, it's probably going to be short-lived. Emily, obviously you started off as a staffer in Congress, and then you worked your way up to run the GSA. Incredible success story there. But can you tell us, early on in your career, did you have any mentors or people that you looked up to that kind of inspired you?
I did. And I've had wonderful mentors throughout my career. So one gentleman named Harry Catricius, he passed away a few years ago, but he was the one who gave me the opportunity to first get involved in government contracting and let me do my first hearing on government contracting. Even though, to be fair, most members of Congress weren't real excited about going to a hearing on government contracting. But gave me that opportunity. I've had great mentors since then. Angela Stiles, who was the OFPP administrator, and that nerdy job I'd wanted. She was the OFPP administrator at the beginning of the Bush administration. She's become a dear friend, but she's also given me wonderful career advice over the years. Mick Mulvaney, who also became a good friend and a good mentor. So just I think that you learn a lot from your mentors. You also learn a lot from being a mentor. So being sure to pass that advice down also. And the great thing I'd say about government contracting that I found, even working on the Hill back in, again, 1995, 96, this is right after the Newt Gingrich took over Congress, highly partisan time. I still remember people like Steve Kellman, who was Clinton's OFPP administrator, and Stan Soloway, who was working for the administration over the Department of Defense, coming over and spending time and teaching me about government contracting. Here I was, a Republican kid working, 23 years old, working on the Hill. They were at the peak of their careers, and they were spending the time with me. So really grateful for people who did that along the way, and hopefully I'm continuing to do that for people now.
Right.
Yeah. So you mentioned that it's important to be a mentor. What type of advice would you give people looking to launch their career in either government contracting or in IT? What type of advice would you give people?
So the advice I usually give people is, when you're seeking jobs, don't feel that you have to meet 100% of the qualifications before you apply. And I find that this is more with women than it is with men. But women will look at a job ad and they will only apply if they hit 100% of the criteria. And I don't think men tend to do that as much. They tend to sort of look at it as that this is an aspirational list that the company's looking for, rather than a minimum level of requirements.
Right.
So don't be afraid to take on jobs where you're going to have a learning curve. In fact, I'll say one gentleman who ended up becoming a cabinet secretary also gave me advice sort of mid-career. He said that his ideal job, first day, you can do a third of the work very easily, a third of the work is a little challenging, and a third of the work is a reach, because then you're really growing your career. If you're looking for a job in the federal government, I'd say that as you're going for the next job, don't just chase the grade, which is the pay raise. Chase the experience. Because if you just chase a grade into a job where you're going to be miserable, or you're not going to have the opportunities to continue growing, then you've dead-ended yourself. But if you chase the experience, the grades will come, and the promotions will come. So making yourself the most desirable, most well-rounded, having the most experiences and expertise, which can sometimes mean becoming incredibly focused in one area. I don't mean to say that you have to be an expert in everything, but really developing that. And then the third one is, you never know who you're going to work with in the future. So I still look back, and the woman who was my deputy at GSA, I first met her when I was an admin assistant, and she was the deputy general counsel. And she then became, 20-something years later, she was working for me. But she had always been so kind and respectful and encouraging when I was that young person who she didn't need to. There was no advantage in her being nice to me. And you never forget that. Sure. But what she remembered from me was that I gave my all to every project, and no matter how small or how little. So it's sort of that combination of be good to the people around you, but give everything your all.
I want to go back to the skills-based hiring that you're referring to in the federal government, right? So one of the challenges, I would imagine, in the government space is trying to compete with public sector salaries, right? We know that especially the big tech companies have the ability to throw around a lot of cash. We saw that during COVID. We saw that during the Great Resignation. And if you're in a government role, that's got to be fairly attractive. So I guess I've got a two-part question. One is, I guess, how does the government deal with that? But as a follow-on to that, is there an opportunity, based on what you were saying earlier, we're going skills-based, using channels like VetTech, Is there actually an opportunity for the government to almost become a place of apprenticeships where those people come in, they can be skilled, they can be trained, they can develop. It can be a place of development for those people where they can grow, rather than trying to compete with more senior experienced resources as compared to what's happening in the private sector with the ability to pay people far more than the government can pay.
Absolutely, because I mean the government salaries are not bad salaries. They're adjusted to where you live, and especially at an entry level, the salaries are fairly good. It's only when you become that mid or senior level, that the salaries don't really compare as well with those in the private sector. So I think if the government really wants to focus on bringing in highly talented and highly skilled people, focusing on skills assessments or some of their basis of proving that someone has subject matter expertise, and then training them in the government's way of doing things, because the government doesn't function the same way as a private company does on a day-to-day basis. You see a lot of people come in who've got expertise in business, and they think that they're going to know how to do something, and they get themselves in trouble because in the private sector you can do whatever you want to unless it's illegal. In the government, you can't do anything until there's a law that says you can do it. So people find themselves in a lot of trouble. I'll give an example on skills-based, though. When I was the administrator at GSA, we wanted to hire an editor. And the question I had was, okay, as we're hiring this person, what are we looking for? I said, well, I'd like to give them an editing test. Give them a document, have them edit it, have the finalists. And so we couldn't do that. That wasn't permitted. We had to look just at their references, any writing samples they gave us, and their resume, which doesn't actually tell you if someone can edit something.
No.
In the same way, though, when we're looking at emerging technologies and really needing support, the piece of paper that the degree doesn't tell you if someone can do it or if they've kept up on their skills or anything else. Whereas being a recent graduate of vet tech tells you that someone's met a certain threshold of competency, and that they're up to date with their skills and that they're going to be able to hit the ground running. And that, to me, is a much better deal for the government. And frankly, even if those employees don't stay with the government their entire careers, if they hit that mid-late career level, that's a loss to the government, but that's actually really good for the veteran who came in and then is able to leverage that into an even better life for his or her family later on.
So on I guess an adjacent point, Emily, do you believe that people who hold senior roles within government need to have some sort of private sector experience?
I think it's good to have it. I don't think it's necessary to have it. I think that there is, I think that I was better at my jobs because I've been both in the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the private sector. I think even in the private sector, I've been a lawyer, working on government contracting, as well as an executive working on government contracting. I think all of those experiences made me better at being able to see an issue, problem spot, and come up with solutions. That said, I think that there are people who have spent their entire careers in government who become incredibly skilled at how to work that bureaucracy and how to see the creative solution and do things. So I think that having the partnership between those people is always is good as well. And you don't want to reject people who've not been in the private sector, because I want young people to come in and consider a job in government and think that they've got a future there. And they do, and developing that expertise can be wonderful. But I do think that having also people in there who come in mid-career or have had other experiences makes for a healthier, government ecosystem.
Well, Emily, this has been very informative, and it's been, obviously we've known you for a while, but to get to hear more about your story and it's really incredible, and I think it'll be inspiring for a lot of our listeners. Now we're going to have a little bit of fun with you, though.
All right.
Do something called the lightning round on Opportunity Accelerators. Are you ready for this?
So, are you ready, Emily?
I'm ready.
All right. First question.
We're afraid, but ready.
All right, here we go. First question. Least favorite member of the royal family?
Andrew.
Oh, don't blame me. Have you ever visited Africa?
Yes.
Texting or talking?
Talking.
Wildest cab ride location?
DC.
Nickname your parents used to call you?
Sweet pea.
Scale of 1 to 10. How good a driver are you?
6, 7.
Fill in the blank. King Charles is?
King.
Yeah.
Your dog agrees with that. Invisibility or super strength?
Invisibility.
How many pets do you have?
2. You can hear
What's
them.
your favorite? Yeah. What's your favorite clothing brand?
Talbots.
Have you ever eaten insects?
No.
How many times
Not
have
that
you
I
heard Joe? How many times have you heard Joe Mitchell say "super excited" on this podcast?
Innumerable.
Harry or William?
William.
When you fly, do you use a neck pillow?
No.
Which animal can the world do without? An iguana or an alligator?
Iguana.
All right, there we go. You made it.
There you go.
15 questions. We'll have to digest that at the next advisory board meeting.
Well, Emily, thanks again for being on the show. If anybody would like to get in touch with you, or if you have anything that you'd like to share with the audience, now's the time.
So I would say I am thrilled to be associated with SkillStorm, because you all do something that I think is in real need, which is you take or give the opportunity to veterans and to others who don't have traditional educational backgrounds to come in and make a real contribution, while at the same time having incredible career opportunities. And I'm very proud to be affiliated with SkillStorm.
Thank
So
you. And
all for that opportunity.
it's an honor to have you on your board, and it's been great working with you, and just, super excited, Joe,
Super excited.
about the future. So thanks again. And it's been another episode of Opportunity Accelerators. Thanks for listening, everybody.
This episode of Opportunity Accelerators has been brought to you by SkillStorm, where our purpose as an organization is to launch and accelerate tech careers. Please be sure to like and subscribe to catch the next episode.